This article is a perfect example of how Canadian media is totally failing to meet the moment here. In fact, it annoyed me so much that I am dedicating an entire video to it. For context, Paul Wells is probably one of the most prominent columnists in Canada. He wrote for the Toronto Star, he wrote for Maclean's, and now he has a Substack that has tons of subscribers. Which is kind of concerning when you consider how many Canadians are getting a picture painted for them of Pierre Poilievre that is honestly leaving out a ton of essential context. Because not only was this article written for a political reality that hasn't existed for about a decade, it's also written in a way that, and this is something I ran into a lot when I was in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, that is more designed to flex about how much access Paul Wells had to Pierre Poilievre and all of the stuff he anecdotally knows personally, than actually painting a big picture of the reality of how Poilievre treats everyone. And the experience you will get with a conservative politician as a white male National Post columnist is probably very different than the experience that some other people might have with, say, Pierre Poilievre. In media, you don't generally report on single source stories that you can't independently verify. So I won't tell you the individual stories that I've heard over the years, although I will say that the sources have ranged from conservative staffers to family members of prominent liberal politicians who have told me about their private dealings with Poilievre when no cameras or anything is around. And without getting into specifics, those stories paint a picture that I would not exactly describe as courteous. Yet that is exactly how Wells tries to frame the public profile of Pierre Poilievre, as someone who is unfailingly courteous in private. While in public, he can be different, he can be belligerent, pompous, contemptuous. But the overarching theme is that Poilievre isn't like that in private, it's just in public, because according to Paul Wells, he was always nice to me. Because no one's ever experienced a dude who can be a dick being nice to his male friends or dudes he wants to impress. They're always consistent in that, right? But acknowledging that seems to be outside of the capacities of Paul Wells in this article, which is wild when you consider what a massive platform he has and how respected he is in Canadian media. As evidence of Poilievre's capacity to be this patient and generous man privately, Paul Wells gives the following examples. The times Poilievre was polite and nice to him, the times Poilievre was polite and nice to people selling him a sandwich at a shop he goes to all the time, the times he's polite and nice to people at his own rallies, and how he's polite and nice to people on an airline flight and some of his own MPs. This is like the bare minimum of when politicians should be on their best behavior. If they can't pass this test, then they are terrible at this job. Like, oh, he was polite to people working a customer service job when he was literally hanging out with a columnist who could write about how he behaves. He was polite to his own supporters, and when he got onto an airplane where anyone could see him and where he's previously held publicity stunts, like speaking on the intercom to the flight of passengers. And he's at times nice to Paul Wells and select MPs. Yeah, that's really just covering a wide gamut of people. But to be fair, Paul Wells does contrast this private kindness and generosity with the fact that Poilievre is always looking for a fight, specifically with people whose authority is not often questioned. He takes pleasure in making their life uncomfortable, Wells tells us. Like, I guess when he makes life uncomfortable for trans people by saying they don't exist. Somehow Wells leaves that part out. He doesn't even mention trans people in this entire article. Now, Wells does acknowledge that sometimes when Poilievre is railing against the elite and figures of authority, he does make quote-unquote exceptions. Wells gives us one example of this exception in action, a sold-out fundraiser at a private home in Toronto where Poilievre took a selfie with someone who, it's very important for us to know, is a banker that is a friend of Paul Wells, because he's friends with very important people, you know. He's got great access. But he frames this, again, as an exception, which is so out of touch and not reflective of how Poilievre has been campaigning, fundraising, and sucking up to people that it borderlines on disinforming the public. In addition to that one fundraiser at a fancy house in Toronto, he also has held fundraisers twice at the mansion of a guy who profits from privatized healthcare facilities in the US. Those events were in Montreal. Poilievre is cozying up to Shopify's broligarchs, tweeting that other corporations need to learn from them in every way, while granting exclusive interviews to the wife of a Shopify executive who is Candice Malcolm from True North, all while denigrating media that actually asks him tough questions. Pierre Poilievre's wife also confirmed in the fall that the Shopify bros are supporting her cause by allowing her the use of their office space in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. Cozy. And in addition to granting one of his rare one-on-ones to the wife of a Shopify executive, he also granted one of these to multi-millionaire Jordan Peterson. So words matter, and I'm not sure exception is the word I would use to describe that phenomenon. If this article is the only thing you read about Pierre Poilievre, you're left with the impression that not only is he privately a very courteous and friendly guy, but that he's publicly a fighter who generally, with a few exceptions, is railing against those in authority positions who aren't normally criticized. Not only would I argue that that is inaccurate, but you also walk away with no understanding of how he's been speaking about vulnerable communities like trans people. So look, columnists writing articles that seem primarily designed to flex about their access have always been annoying. But in the current political moment where we're dealing with the rise of the far right, attacks on vulnerable groups, and an information ecosystem that is more toxic and polluted than ever, this kind of insipid analysis is almost dangerous. I am not interested in reading another article written by someone who spends it flexing about their level of access when that level of access seems to be the reason why their judgment of that individual is so totally clouded. But hey, at least in this self-important masturbatory article, Paul Wells does show some humility. He does call himself clumsy. That's sure to get the boys at the Met chuckling, isn't it? So yeah, if we're gonna meet the moment here, we gotta do better than this. What do you think of all this?